Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, our listeners and viewers around the world. We appreciate you joining us as we dive into meaningful dialogue about Palestine, offering an insight and context that is missing from mainstream media, while celebrating also Palestine's rich culture, traditions, and heritage. Today, we have a very special guest, a return visit to this podcast. Back in November 2024, we spoke with Dr. Victor Kattan about Palestinian history and international law. Since then, Victor has launched what may be the most significant legal campaign in Palestinian history. In September 2025, Victor and a team of leading barristers and scholars filed a 400-page petition to the British government, arguing something unprecedented, that Britain's entire occupation of Palestine from 1917 to 1948 was unlawful. Not just that Britain committed particular crimes, but that they had no legal right to be there. And we'll also be discussing the Israeli atrocities that trace directly back to Britain's unlawful occupation and, of course, the Balfour Declaration. Since we last spoke, Victor has become lead legal expert on Britain Owes Palestine. This petition, supported by top barristers like Ben Emmerson KC and Friedman KC, and scholars including John Quigley and Israeli historian Avi Shlaim, who you may remember we did a podcast with. If you haven't, do go back and listen. And this is the first time that Britain is being held legally accountable for an occupation that violated international law, arguably, from the moment it began. So, Victor, welcome back to the Enlightenment Podcast. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks, it's great. I think it was almost exactly a year ago when I was last on this show. Am I the only person you've interviewed twice?
You are. Thank you
Yeah.
for
Oh, so there
mentioning
you
that.
go.
Of
I'm
course, I
very
think that you've immediately put yourself into the top 1% of our podcast guests. Look at that. I love
it. Even more, Shamim. Exactly. So, for those of you also who missed our first podcast in November, exactly last year, with my cousin Victor, who is from our Bethlehem side of the Kattan family, please do watch it. It's amazing. And just to give you a bit of background, we are related from both our grandparents' sides. So, Ahlan, and welcome again, cousin Victor, and lovely to see you again.
Likewise, lovely to see you.
Thank you, Habib. So let's dive right in. Personal history shapes our understanding of injustice. And when we did the podcast last year, you hadn't yet filed Britain Owes Palestine as a campaign, which is really important. So how did this amazing team come together? And really, the aim is to demand, we'll talk about more detail, but to demand Britain to be held legally accountable. And why now? And what was the catalyst, basically?
Thanks, Hanan. So the brainchild, if you like, behind this was Mr. Munib Al-Masri, who's a Palestinian industrialist and philanthropist. And he, I think for a long time now, felt very strongly that something had to be done about whether it was simply raising awareness or seeking an apology from the British government for the violations of international law they committed in Palestine when they were the mandatory or the colonial power. In his mother had been beaten when he was a child. He'd been shot in the leg by British soldiers, and of course the Nakba happened under Britain's watch. So the conflict began. The mandate was effectively the incubator for the modern Arab-Israeli conflict, the genocide in Gaza that we see today. So he felt very strongly something needed to be done. But the question is how. He's a businessman, he's not a lawyer. And so one of the difficulties he had was trying to find the kind of team that could pull this off. So I think I subsequently learned that he spoke to lots of different people, but it wasn't until he met someone called Ben Emmerson, who's a King's Counsel, that the idea started to percolate. And then Ben approached me about 3 years ago. I think that he also, he's a King's Counsel, so he's not an academic. So I think they were running into some difficulty, and they were looking for people to join the team, and that's when they approached me and Avi Shlaim, and then we joined the team. Then Friedman came on board. Well, he was already involved. Danny was involved earlier, but he became more involved in a bigger way. And then someone called John Quigley, who's a professor of international law in the United States and has written many books on the legal aspects. So there aren't many people out there who've written legal histories of this period. There are lots of historians who've written about this period, but not so much from the legal angle. And it's quite specific to find a group of people who have that skill, who are both lawyers and comfortable doing historical work, and then who are already knowledgeable or have the documents at their fingertips covering this period. At the same time, we needed the practitioners. We needed the Ben Emmerson and Danny Friedman, because they know how to write and to mold our ideas into a petition that can be digestible by a government body. Because ultimately, this petition was given to the British Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Office, the Department for Defense, and the Attorney General. So it has to be written in a specific way. So you need people who are public lawyers, constitutional lawyers, who practice daily and do this kind of work. At the same time, they themselves could not do it on their own. They needed international lawyers, people who are familiar with colonial law and the like. So it was really quite magical that we managed to get this team together. It needed the timing had a lot to do with the difficulty of finding the right people. That was really key. Because of course barristers, so I, as an academic, I have a full-time job. Barristers, they get briefs coming in all the time from different clients. So again, it's finding the time to do the work. The timing was, so this project's been going on for years, and it comes out literally, it's been 2 months now. So it predated the genocide in Gaza. So it's not related to that, and it's not related either to the British decision to recognize Palestine, which happened a week after we submitted our petition, or a few days later. It's just a coincidence that this coincided at the same time. Nor was it was simply happenstance that our other lovely cousin Anne-Marie Jasser's film Palestine 36 came out exactly the same time as our petition.
Yeah,
It's quite, when you want to have be successful in a project, you need the right people, you need money, but you need luck. And the luck is having all these things coming together at the same time, which none of us could have predicted.
Yeah, well, that's speaking of that. So it is a wonderful coincidence. But let's talk about this. So we know, like, Palestine 36 talks about some of the crimes that Britain committed when they had the mandate for Palestine, whether it was massacres, tortures, starvation. But your brief, your petition, argues something far more fundamental, that Britain actually had no legal authority to be in Palestine at all. So can you just talk a little bit about how the League of Nations Council at that time exceeded its legal powers, and why does this potentially make everything that Britain did in Palestine, even this supposed mandate, null and void from the start?
So our review, and this is we must thank John Quigley, because he was really he's done a lot of work on this particular issue in depth. We found that actually it was a self-imposed mandate. The British essentially gave themselves the right to rule Palestine, and there wasn't actually concurrence from the other members of the Council of the League of Nations. In fact, they were still debating over whether it was even consistent with Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, whether basically transforming the democracy and the identity of a country from being a majority Arab state to a Jewish state was even lawful, because Article 22 of the Covenant, spoke of the well-being and development of the existing Ottoman communities living in Palestine. It didn't promise people who were not citizens from a different part of the world sovereign rights. And so you see these arguments raised. In fact, it's really interesting because it's raised by the Vatican, the Holy See, in the debate. And the British government is basically forced to backtrack and basically say, of course, we will not prejudice the rights of the indigenous Palestinian Arab population. We just want to improve their economic well-being, etc. And that's got an interesting. I mean, I'd like perhaps to write a bit more about that particular story, because I don't think it's so well known. But there were others raising this issue. The Brazilians, the Belgians, and others were talking about this. So we found that the British claim was really tenuous to Palestine, and the way we describe it is basically it's Britain's self-imposed mandate is almost an emanation of the occupation. So they were initially occupying power. The traditional argument is from 1917 until, not clear, 1920, or was it 1922, or was it 1924? There are different arguments about that. But in fact, Cecil Hurst, who was the principal legal advisor at the Foreign Office in a case before the Permanent Court of International Justice, when he was asked about this, he basically said Britain's rights emanate from the law of occupation. It's just a continuation of the same occupation. Occupation cannot transfer title to an occupying power. So yeah, the whole roots of this are very murky indeed.
Mm.
And you mentioned Professor John Quigley, one of your colleagues. He discovered a devastating thing in the British archives, which very few, it's been a secret for almost 100 years. And this was in 1923, immediately after the mandate entered into force.
But it didn't enter into force.
Sorry?
The mandate it didn't enter into force until 1924.
Oh, 24.
That's
Okay.
important because the memorandum is 1923. So the British government, if they had wanted to, could have withdrawn from the. So that's what the memorandum was saying. It was saying Britain still, if it wants to, can withdraw from Palestine because because of the diametrically opposed, impossible policy, the contradiction of creating a Jewish national home in a country that's overwhelmingly Palestinian. So that memorandum basically says that it's impossible to reconcile these two policy objectives, and Britain should withdraw, or else they can maintain it for the honor of the British Empire. But this would mean arming the Jews to basically take over the country and rule it by force. And that's basically what they decided to do.
Well, thank you for correcting me. And Victor, so this sort of this secret internal assessment, if you like. So can you talk a bit more about who wrote it, and why did the British continue despite knowing the consequences? And how does this prove their intent and their legal liability with everything else that followed, including the Nakba? Just too many questions.
So it's called, it was a memorandum by Victor Cavendish, who was a senior official. It was actually a cabinet memorandum. So got the most senior officials in the government. And to cut a long story short, they said for the honor and the prestige of the empire, it would be unconscionable for them to withdraw so late from Palestine. And so they decided just to continue with this policy, knowing full well it was likely to lead to catastrophe, knowing full well that it was weak, that the Balfour policy was weak and a flagrant contradiction of other pledges they had given, that it was hardly consistent with their obligations to be there under the Article 22 of the Covenant. So they knew that from the start, but they hushed it up.
Wow. And so were there particular officials, British officials, who objected internally to this policy?
I mean, there were people objecting from the moment of the Balfour policy. Lord Curzon, who's Kedleston Manor around the corner from where I live, down in Derby, he pointed out to the contradiction from the beginning. The Palestinian Arabs are not going to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. They're not going to accept to be second-class citizens in their own country. It's a perilous policy. It will rankle in the thorn of the flesh of whichever power is responsible for it, and we should withdraw while we can. That was his advice. It wasn't taken on. And then there was Edwin Montagu, who ironically was the only Jewish member of the cabinet, who also said it was a crazy policy that would prejudice the rights of Jews in other countries, because the anti-Semites would say they're not really Europeans, they belong somewhere else. So there was always this internal, as there is, I think there's always been in the government, always internal opposition, but for reasons I've never fully understood, the Zionist camp tends to always win out.
Yeah. Victor, let's talk about the Balfour Declaration, because I always, prior to learning a bit more, I thought it was just some legal thing, but it was a political letter. To one of the Rothschilds.
It was a private letter, actually.
A private letter, not even a private letter, had no legality in and of itself. It's somebody writing to somebody else.
Yeah.
So where does this? Because it also then led to a whole chain of events, which led to Britain's involvement in Palestine. Where does the specific illegality collapse under the ultra vires argument? Can you spell it out plainly for those of us who are not lawyers?
So start with the Balfour Declaration. It's basically a statement of policy, and it was done by the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, addressed to Lord Rothschild, a member of the House of Lords, a relative of the famous banking dynasty. I mean, I can tell you a lot about the history because it's not so well known. That's another story. Because they had a relationship going back to debates on immigration in the early 1900s. But
right.
The Zionist argument is that they also agree it wasn't binding, it was a policy, but once it was put in the mandate, it became lawful, and it became a letter of international law. It was no longer policy, but a solemn obligation. And you also see that argument even in the Permanent Mandates Commission being made. But the problem is that the whole constitutional structure, the whole mandate system, the whole right to have mandates, to govern the former colonies of the Ottoman Empire, and Germany in the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific. It's based on this clause that first appears in the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War in Article 22. And it's based on this notion that the primary obligation is to promote the well-being and development of the Ottoman communities as a so-called sacred trust of civilization. So that's the primary goal. And the argument would be that any document that conflicts with that is null and void. It cannot have any effect. And that's the argument that the Vatican, the Holy See, was trying to make in 1922, which is why the mandate was delayed and delayed and delayed. The other issue is it depended on the peace treaty with Turkey. So the original idea was that Turkey, which was a sovereign power, would acquiesce to the Balfour policy, and they were obliged to sign this treaty called the Treaty of Sèvres. But that treaty never entered into force because of the subsequent events in Anatolia that when the Turks defeated the Greeks. So it never became binding. So then they had to renegotiate everything in another treaty called the Treaty of Lausanne, which they did 3 years later. But the Turks never agreed to the Balfour policy. The Balfour policy doesn't appear at all in the Treaty of Lausanne, which didn't enter into force until 1924. And you had no discussions at the Council of the League of Nations at all about the legality of the Balfour policy, the mandate, since 1922. So it's basically the Brits saying, well, we're going to take it upon ourselves simply to administer Palestine according to this policy which we've told the world we're going to pursue, and that's it. And so that's basically what happens. And it seems that the Council of the League of Nations or the European, they kind of act. You could argue maybe they acquiesce to it in a way, or they're not fully aware because there were so many changes of government as well. European governments collapsed in the 1920s, early 1920s, that some of them may have not been aware of these earlier discussions as well. So you see some really interesting debates in 1920 in what was called the San Remo Conference, which is it's just distorted a lot also by the Zionist lobby, if you like, because they argue that their rights emanate from this conference. But when you look at what was discussed by the Italians and the French and the others and the Belgians, they were like, well, we can't just take away the rights of the indigenous Ottoman Palestinian population because they had rights. They were participating in electing and holding office in the Ottoman Empire. And therefore, we can only agree to this immigration policy if they agree themselves. There has to be some kind of legislature. There has to be some kind of recognizing that they were existing Ottoman citizens. We can't strip them of these rights. But that's exactly what Britain did. Britain never established a legislature. They only issued proposals whereby the Arab majority would not have control over their own future. So it would be a British-dominated legislature, which was never acceptable to the Palestinians. So it was a very authoritarian system. The High Commissioner was given all power. He basically ran the place as though it was a colony or basically a military occupation in all but name.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. That there must have been, well, first of all, Article 22 of the League Covenant, just to explain how that is not even, it may or may not be relevant in this scenario. And then, as you said, Britain had certain requirements to fulfill, even if they did have a mandate in the 1920s, and they deliberately chose not to do that, including, as you say, setting up a form of government that wasn't authoritarian. Were there other things that they failed to do, and how does that relate to the?
I mean, the mandate was written in the mandate text, which we argue is ultra vires, was written in a very odd way. So if you compare it to the other mandates for Mesopotamia and Syria and Lebanon, they recognize the organic law of the territory, but for Palestine, they say no, the High Commissioner will have full powers of making the law and enforcing it. Again, it's almost like they try to treat Palestine as a crown colony, but it isn't because the UK doesn't have sovereignty over it. So it's this kind of weird mix whereby they're going to do whatever they want to pursue this policy, and if the law gets in the way, the law gets in, they're going to do it anyway. So yeah, it's a very murky history. The Brits wanted Palestine for various reasons, and they were going to take it and enforce and impose this policy on the Palestinian Arabs, regardless of whether they liked it or not, regardless of what the Covenant of the League of Nations said.
Yeah.
Mm. And that's quite important, because then they took over, and in the 20s and 30s, we did a podcast with Thomas Suarez, who wrote about the continuous aggression by the Zionist terrorist groups against the Palestinians. But let's also talk about what you mentioned, our cousin Anne-Marie. So that crucial period that cemented, if you like, the Britain's colonial grip and made the Nakba inevitable, which is the Great Palestinian Revolt from 1936 to 39. I mean, most people, Anne-Marie kindly invited us to the premiere with the iconic sort of Palestinian artist Samia Halabi, our aunt, and we did a podcast with Anne-Marie on that film and her work, and also
Came to Nottingham as well, I think, Samia Halabi.
Yes, she did. She did
Yes,
come to.
yeah,
She
yeah.
did go to, and it's all interlinked, because it was when Samia was born that year as well, and so it's very important part of history for us. So can you explain, Victor, to the audience how Britain's brutal suppression of this Palestinian revolt, and how they were at the same time training and empowering the Zionists, and this military made it impossible, or this crackdown made it impossible for Palestinians to resist 9 years later during the 48 Nakba?
Thank you. So yes, well, I think Palestine 36 brilliantly shows how the Arab revolt began, was the strike, the suppression of all national rights of the Palestinians, and it kind of it dramatizes the events in a way that no lawyer or novelist can do as effectively, which is why I think it's such a brilliant film, and complements the work we do so much. But to answer your question, so the British established a system whereby it was not possible for Palestinians to peacefully oppose. There was no way they could oppose the Balfour policy. You know, they could write petitions to the League of Nations, but they would be ignored. They could complain to the High Commissioner, but they would be ignored. There was no legislative assembly established, because the Brits knew that if they established a legislature, it would reflecting the fact that the Palestinian Arabs were the 90% of the population. They would not allow this policy to take effect. There would be no further Jewish emigration, etc. So it was in this context, especially with a massive increase of Jewish migrants coming into Palestine following events in Europe, with the rise of the Third Reich and the National Socialists, that the Palestinians resorted, if you like, to a strike, first of all, 6-month strike, and then violence. And this is when the High Commissioner imposed martial law, brought in, tens of thousands of troops from overseas, from different parts of the British Empire, and resorted to very violent counterinsurgency tactics, which they then imposed, that they'd learned from other parts of the empire, Ireland, probably from the Boer Wars, India, and elsewhere. And Shamim has mentioned torture, things like waterboarding were quite commonplace, blowing up people's homes, so home demolitions. In fact, the home demolitions that Israel continues to use until today in the West Bank are based on British legislation, emergency legislation from the 1930s. There was summary justice, so you had trials being undertaken in police stations by people who were not legally trained. And when the Chief Justice complained about this policy, he was removed or forced to take a generous pension, was how they got rid of him. There were people shot while trying to escape. And so this comes out from the archival documents, the Brits knowing and admitting internally that these things were happening. Villages were put into cages, which we saw most graphically in Anne-Marie's film Palestine 36, left without any sustenance. The famous Al-Bassa massacre, which they call Al-Basma in the film Palestine 36, is actually something that really did happen. So they punished the villagers so basically you punish the community for the actions of an individual. So there was a British British military officials were attacked and killed, and they then basically just looked at the nearest village to where the attack took place and punished the entire village. And if they didn't fess up, uh, be caged and harmed. And what they did was in the Al-Bassa massacre is they put all the young men on a bus, and then they made it drive over a mine that had been hidden, and it exploded, killing everyone. So things like these were happening throughout Palestine. Of course, the Palestinian rebels were attacking British positions. They blew up the oil line, the oil pipeline between Haifa and went through Syria to Mosul in Iraq, which had been running for many years until the Nakba in 48, and has an interesting history in and of itself. So there were all these terrible things that were happening, and then there's appeal commission. The British government say, okay, we need to look into the origins of the roots of the disturbance and come up with a solution to placate the Palestinians and satisfy the Jews. And that's also captured quite well, I thought, in the film. But the appeal commission, everyone forgets. Its terms of reference they were not allowed to question the underlying basis of the British policy. They couldn't question the Balfour Declaration. They were not allowed to touch on the issue of Jewish immigration and land sales. So that really limited what the options they could come up with, which also is one reason why they ended up supporting this terrible idea of partition and forced population exchanges. And I should also mention, this is also a very important period of history because it's during the Arab Revolt that Britain sets up the special night squads, this Jewish counter-terrorism unit, which they use to help suppress the Arab rebellion. So one of the chief officers involved, again, he's in the film, I think he's played very well by Robert Aramayo, is Captain Orde Wingate, who's this evangelical psychopath, if I'm going to be blunt about it, who enjoys torturing Palestinians. He teaches leaders of the Jewish counterinsurgency movement, what was then the Haganah, including Moshe Dayan, who becomes a defense minister, and others, about how to deal with the Arabs. And many of these tactics are still being used to this day with brutal effect. So it's really a key moment. Which is why the rebellion and the whole British history, and you can't really understand the rebellion without understanding how Britain ended up in Palestine in the first place, is really key. And this is also important about the petition, because it's quite unusual in that if you look at other petitions, they might, like massacres in Kenya or in Malaya. So the one in Malaya is about one specific incident. In Kenya, it's about a 10-year or 15-year Mau Mau uprising. This is not just about the Arab Revolt, our petition. It's about the entire mandate, all 30 years. It's looking systemically at the entire period. So it's quite unique in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's fast forward to the ICJ's 19th of July 2024 advisory opinion, which found Israel's regime of occupation was unlawful on self-determination grounds. Can you connect the dots for us there, Victor? How does this recent finding from the ICJ retrospectively validate your argument about Britain's conduct a century earlier?
It doesn't, because that was very specifically the question, and the way in which the court answered the question was very specifically focused on post-1967 developments. They deliberately avoided, although some states did raise policies prior to 1967, and the court did look at the emergency defense regulations as well, and the policy of house demolitions, because you can't understand those without understanding how they are rooted in colonial legislation. So they briefly touch on it, but they try to avoid all those issues. But yeah, it's the same. And it's a tricky issue, because under the League of Nations you had a different different notion of international law, a different court that was then replaced by another one after 1945. And the whole development of international human rights law is really in a state of embryonic development in the interwar years. It doesn't really, I mean, the kind of human rights we know today didn't really exist. Although you had this idea of a concept of a law of humanity, which we do rely on. You had some basic principles in the law of occupation, but it's not human rights law as such. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, is only negotiated during the Nakba, actually, while the Nakba is ongoing, but it's not It wasn't binding in and of itself. The kind of binding human rights treaties didn't come along until the 1960s.
Mm. And Victor, your petition, I think you have 7 key demands that were made. Can you walk us through them, and what would an apology and actually justice, if you like, actually look like and include?
Good question. I haven't got the screen on me, so I'm not going to read out the 7 demands to you, but in a nutshell, what they are is we want the British government to acknowledge the petition, to read it, so it's 430 pages, and to respond to it. And in responding, we want them to consider the evidence that we have provided, which is all British documents. And we're asking them in that process to release any further documents that they haven't yet released into the National Archives that support the allegations, because we suspect that some may be suppressed even until this day. Then we want the Prime Minister, whoever that may be, to issue an apology in the House of Commons. So we're quite specific on that. We want the person who's the chief executive, if you like, of the government to do the job of that. And then we've asked for a conversation about reparations. Now, I need to be careful about reparations, because reparations has a colloquial meaning and has a specific meaning in law. A lot of people associate just with money, for instance, but reparations can include an apology, for example. It may include money as well, but it doesn't include what the Daily Mail claimed, which is we're not asking for trillions of pounds, and they tried to make that claim, which we don't ask for any money, in fact, in the document. Was
I can't believe the Daily Mail is making ridiculous claims, Victor.
To scare the government away. So if we look at other examples of instances where the UK has apologized, they've apologized for deporting children. Gordon Brown, they deported 150,000 children were taken away from their parents and sent to Canada and Australia in the 1950s and 60s. They apologized for that. What else have they done? There was a Mau Mau uprising that they apologized for, and then they also gave money towards a memorial in Nairobi for the uprising, and I think money was also given to some of the survivors as well. It's about 10 or 12 million pounds, I think they did in that case. And then earlier this year, they gave an apology to the victims of a massacre that occurred in Colonial Malaya, which the British government had denied that they had any responsibility for prior to that. Now, for the massacres in Malaya and in Kenya, these only took place, were only accorded after more than a decade of legal the issues went to the courts. And in Kenya they won, in Malaya they didn't, but it didn't matter because by bringing it to the courts and struggling with the government for over 10, 15 years, the British government eventually felt they had to say something. We don't know what they're going to do in this case, in our case. In terms of reparations, we've left that open. We've suggested it's a dialogue between the 14 petitioners, the British government, and the legal advisors about what that may look like. Whether it's the big one we're currently thinking about is education. We think that this is such an important historical moment that you can't understand the current geopolitics or the conflict in Palestine without understanding the history. It should be in school. It should be in the national curriculum. It should be in school textbooks. People should not have to learn about this from the media. They should know about this from school. It should be really, it's really something important. And we also want to provoke a national conversation about this, because we think it's really, you can't really understand anything, frankly, if you don't know this. This is the precursor to all the violence since it didn't begin in 1967. So all the ICJ stuff is all very well and good, but it doesn't really touch on the key issue, which at the end of the day is what everyone seems to be scared of looking at, which is to go back to the mandate. So we want to provoke that discussion. We want to have that discussion. We want to have it out loud, which is why, again, Anne-Marie's film is also so important, because it brings so vividly and dramatically the events to light. So that's what we're looking for, and we hope that the government will respond. There have been MPs that have asked the government when they're going to respond, and the government keeps saying they will in due course. Between ourselves, we're saying 6 to 9 months would be a decent time, because it is there's a lot. The government's very busy and there's a lot of evidence in the document. maximum maybe a year. But if we don't get a response, and they might then bring an application for judicial review to force the government to respond. If the government says that they're not going to apologize, we may also challenge that. Or if the government says something really silly, we may also challenge that. And that's at the moment where we're going. Whether there are other forums we could raise this, there may be possibilities. At the moment, we must remember this is a domestic issue. It's petitioners. It's a private initiative. It's not involving Palestine as a state. Again, the Daily Mail mixed that up. I'm not saying that the state of Palestine might not become involved, later down the line if an apology is not given, for instance. But
they
that's
need
not
to
what
stop. They need to stop being a Vichy government for the settler colony of Israel to start with. But sorry, Victor, I interrupted you.
So there are all these issues, and of course, we shouldn't forget the British government is still training Israeli officers to this very day. They never stopped their training programs throughout the conflict, throughout the horrors we've seen in Gaza. They withdrew a few licenses, but the majority of the licenses for weapons are still being exported to Israel, and they even were assisting them with, as you know, with flights from Cyprus, which they only ended when the hostages were released. So they were only using those for the hostages. And we've seen our Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, every opportunity always emphasizes the hostages before he discusses the death toll of Palestinians in Gaza. So we know where their sympathy lies, and it's been the same for over 100 years, and we just hope we can change. We know that it seems the public, or not everybody, but large sections of the public are very upset about this. I feel like the government wants to brush it under the carpet. The so-called war is over now, go home. But I don't. But the importance of the campaign and the film and all the work that's being done by countless other organizations is to keep this going. There's got to be a momentum, because we can't just keep going back to the same old tired, initiatives to end the conflict and put plasters over a gaping wound, which is what they seem to do each time.
That's right. And also, just for the audience, Britain still owns, I think, around 4%, 3 to 4% of Cyprus with their military base. And as you said, Victor, they are spying, and they've been spying throughout the genocide, and training and funding and so on and so forth. So it's not enough just to acknowledge. I think there has to be consequence to their actions as well.
Absolutely,
yeah. So the UK formally recognised Palestine as a state on 21st September 2025, for whatever that's worth, which was 2 weeks after you filed on September 7th. I think you said that was maybe coincidental, but your petition argues that Britain has spent 25 years illegally denying that same statehood. So does this recognition help the case at all?
Well, because as I said, it's a private initiative, so it's not related at all in that sense. It's relevant to the extent that Palestine is now. The Brits should have recognized Palestine, when they left in 1948, but they didn't do that. And that period, by the way, in the petition is also a lot of that's quite new material. So the petition's occupation, repression, partition, the material on partition, and how the Brits kind of abandoned Palestine is worth reading if you haven't had a chance to look, because that is quite, I think, groundbreaking material which hasn't been covered by many authors yet. So again, I said that a lot of this work is building up on my work, on John Quigley's work, on Avi Shlaim's work, and the work of many other scholars. But we also did some original research as well in the petition, and the period where the British left and didn't recognize Palestine, but only recognized Israel and then Jordan is an important part of the story. So I think it's good that they did finally do that. But again, it was much too late. I was actually at the opening of the embassy I didn't go there for that reason. I just happened to be in London that day. My father's birthday, so I was in town, and I thought, I have to go back to Nottingham, so I might as well spend and I got an invitation from the ambassador, and actually, even though I'm not an ambassador, I got into the ambassadorial sector, so it's quite it's quite good too. They just let me wave me in, so I enjoyed that. And there were quite a few celebrities there as well. Some I recognized, some I didn't. It was very moving. I mean, I know a lot of people have poo-pooed, this, but actually it was very moving. Hossam Zomlot gave a very powerful speech. Faulkner, Hamish Faulkner, he mentioned the Balfour Declaration and the troubled British history. He didn't go far enough, in my opinion, but he did mention it. And recognition does have consequences for Palestine, and important ones. Including for the ambassador. He is now full ambassador with full immunities. Palestinians now can claim they have citizenship rights. They can claim protection in British courts. It provides some certainty for businesses when investing in Palestine now. So there are maps. I assume maps will now not just show the West Bank and Gaza shaded in some weird color as some kind of disputed territory, but now it's a state. You can actually use the name Palestine. So yeah, I think it's important, but not in and of itself. It should have been recognition and sanctions, given what's going on in Gaza. But perhaps they are holding that back because they're worried about what Netanyahu might do with the West Bank. So I don't think that's off the table, but we have to see.
Yeah.
And also Britain did it collectively.
Yeah, no, I think it's important, but it doesn't go far enough, and we can talk about the solution. So, Victor, what you're saying is you can be kind of stonewalled by Whitehall, they can ignore you, and you can take them back to court or demand something. But where does it land politically if the court does order the government to engage, and what could happen, if you like?
I mean, so if the court could ask the government to respond to the petition. I mean, if they respond in a way we don't like, we have to see what they actually say. We have to see what they say, because there are different forms of judicial review, different heads, and it depends on what they do, what they say, and whether they do a proper job of responding to it. But this is a problem. At the end of the day, it's in the UK government's court. We can't really do more than what we've done. And it's up to them now how they respond to it, which is why the public campaign is probably just as important, if not more important, than the actual process of delivering the petition and waiting for the government to respond.
Yeah.
So it's really getting people to read this document or to be aware of it, to watch the film, and just to talk about it. That's really what's key.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What has been the public response? Because obviously waiting for a legal win is not necessarily the only measure of success. What has been the response, and how do you hope to continue?
I mean, one of the issues that launching this petition in September was there was so much else happening in the news. There was the recognition, the war was still going, the genocide in Gaza was still in full flow. The Israelis that bombed Doha the day before we visited Downing Street. So you can imagine that's where it has been in the newspapers, but there have been so many other stories that are bigger stories. My fear is that maybe some of this stuff may have been initially missed, but I think it is getting out there, and we are constantly trying to find creative ways of getting the story out, including with Anne-Marie's film. I don't know. We haven't done an internal poll on how people have responded to it. We're only able to see how widespread stories have been read online, So the BBC story where I was quoted was widely read by tens of millions of people, if you believe the statistics. I wrote a piece for ABC. There was a video that Munib Al-Masri did, and I briefly appeared with Avi Shlaim. That went viral on Instagram. So we know that the dissemination is happening, but in terms of feedback, we haven't had yet so much feedback. And partly that's because it is a legal document that's over 430 pages long. So the kind of people that would likely read it are most likely to be legally trained people, which is a smaller circle of people. So it's too early to say. I mean, I think we might get more of feedback once the British government responds and once people have the time to digest it.
Yeah, which is actually what Victor, what you did was you had people come in and create a language that sort of politicians, etc., understand. And I think my suggestion is to bring in people to disseminate the 400 plus pages for everyday lay people to understand and to engage with the campaign. You're talking earlier in the podcast how the Zionists are always, their narrative is winning, but I think because they're so organized, so thorough with the whole campaign, they launch things so formidably, even though often and most of the time with lies and fabrications, but they have a whole machine behind them. And I think it's really important to generate that. And you mentioned Professor Avi Shlaim, the Israeli historian who's part of your campaign. He's an Iraqi Arab Jew, a friend. We did a podcast, as we said earlier, with him. He's really, he's been amazing. But he said that the current Gaza genocide is a direct result of the Balfour Declaration and Britain's role. And it is a very strong claim indeed. Could you talk about that link and also that responsibility between the Balfour and today's genocide and what he...
I can't speak for Avi, but I can say what I think he's trying to say, which is that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Balfour policy of trying to create a Jewish national home in Palestine. That's when the whole conflict began. You've got Palestine is 93% Palestinian Arab, Christian and Muslim. And then you're basically encouraging migration away from your countries. Because, it's very similar to what's happening. So you've got mass migration of Jews fleeing persecution in the Pale settlement in Russia and Romania and other places, going basically to the United States via Western Europe. And then they encourage this migration to go to Palestine, and it creates the uprising because of all the other things that the British government are doing, suppressing any Palestinian national rights, etc. So, and we shouldn't forget that when the Brits left in 1948, they left the place in a mess. They left the place in the midst of the conflict. They knew there was a conflict. They knew that the Jewish side was stronger because they'd killed all the Palestinian leaders or deported them to the Seychelles and other parts of the and others had fled to other parts of the Arab world. And they trained many of the Jewish leaders in counterterrorism policy. They knew that they knew what was going to happen, and they had the ability to stop it. Montgomery, in his memoirs, discusses this at length. But to answer your question more quickly, for Palestinians, not history. It's a reality. It's an ongoing reality. The Nakba isn't something that's happened and ended. It's ongoing because when the Brits basically run out or abandoned Palestine, despite their legal obligations, you had the conflict and 85% of the Palestinian population of what was then fled or were expelled. And Gaza is mostly descendants of the refugees from what is now Israel. And so for them, it's ongoing. Gaza, the shape of Gaza is because of the conflict that happened in 1948, the so-called ceasefire lines, the Green Line. So you can't really understand any of this. The fact that they don't have citizenship rights, or they don't have, they have no protection. All this goes back to the mess that the Brits left when they withdrew in 1948.
Very much so. And let's just touch on the solution a little bit, because I think I mentioned last time my view. I believe in one democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea, with justice and freedom and full equality, human dignity for all, including reparations. I know we mentioned those and they were left vague for now in your petition, and complete land and resource restitution to all Palestinians, and of course the right of return as guaranteed under international law. So I think this whole rushing to a so-called peace deal, which is not really a peace deal, it's like pushing a ceasefire with all the injustices, all the inequality is still there. So I would love to know, Victor, what's your vision? I know we talked about it last time, but maybe you can reiterate your vision for Palestinian justice, freedom, equality, dignity, and how do you feel that holding Britain accountable and to apologize will help with that future, if you like?
I don't think it will. It will directly help. An apology is just an apology. It's meaningful and important to Palestinians, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient to resolve all the issues that we've been discussing. I mean, the ideal for many Palestinians is the one that you've described, but the reality and international law is not something that can be. It's not self-executing. It's who's going to enforce it? The Americans are not going to do it. The Brits aren't. And so in some ways, there is work being done. I'm not involved in that, but I am kind of interested in this idea of trying to think of how, in the intermediary phase, you might be able to imagine whether it's two states or a confederation, but in reality, people can live wherever they want to live. There are no borders, or the borders are just open borders. But we're so far removed from that at the moment because of this horrific um, genocide in Gaza that all eyes are on that. And I completely agree with you that the 20-point plan, I was actually interviewed on Al Jazeera about this, is I don't think it's going to go anywhere. It's not clear who will have authority over Gaza. The Israelis seem to want to remain controlling the place. It's not even clear that they're gonna stop fighting. They haven't really. And the key here is why the danger, and I said this in Al Jazeera, is you don't want Arab forces or even Palestinian forces under some kind of Arab umbrella, if the Israelis were even to allow that, to be doing Israel's dirty work. Because if the Israelis maintain overall control and underneath it is just another Palestinian authority, then they're just they're the responsible for the destruction and the killings in Gaza, and so they should be paying for it, and there should be justice for all the Palestinians who've been brutally murdered by them. And until we can even start talking about that, then we're so far removed from any real solution. I mean, whenever I'm asked about it, I always try and talk about transitional justice. So even a year ago, when I was at the Houses of Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, they were talking about, UK recognizing Palestine. So that's important, but what about all the killings? What about justice for Palestinians? They didn't pick up on that point that I made, but they picked up on what I said about recognition. So we have a long way to go, and a long way for people to empathize with Palestinians because they're Palestinians. It's not nice to, why do Palestinians have to die in such large numbers? Children be literally burned to death before people are moved. It's not sustainable. People should understand that there is the Israelis, that there needs to be consequences for what's happened, no matter how long it takes. And we need to shift our governments. They need to listen to what the protesters are saying, and they need to shift their policies, and they're doing it in they always take the least the least odorous policy where they're given a choice, and it's not good enough. And I fear that we're not at the end of this, sadly, and it's not just a question of Netanyahu. Even if he goes, we've still got the same oppressive system, and that's what people need to focus on instead of having debates on football, anti-Semitism at football games and things like that, which are not important.
Exactly, and actually, the majority of Jewish Israelis would rather be the apartheid colonizers and crush the Palestinians than give everybody equal rights as per any other so-called democracy, which clearly they're not.
And we need to have a conversation in the Arab world too. Why are they not doing more as well? Because
they're clearly Arab Zionists, aren't they?
Yeah. So sadly, I fear I'll be asked to come back on here and talk about something else horrible.
Yeah, well, we're always happy to have you talking about all of these things. We just hope that one day it's not required.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
But Victor, if the petition succeeds, let's just look at the best case scenario. If Britain apologizes, acknowledges their violations, investigates, even pays reparations, that would set an extraordinary precedent. So do you think other colonial powers are watching this nervously? How does Palestinian success or failure affect?
So it has happened. They have apologized. They have issued reparations. Maybe not enough, but there have been examples. The German government has apologized for the genocide in what is now called Namibia, Southwest Africa. They've given some quite a bit of money to Namibia. It's not enough. It didn't go far enough. The Japanese have done something similar for comfort women. Again, the activists say it's not enough, but they have done something. The UK did it for the Mau Mau crushing of the Mau Mau rebellion. So there are examples for the Irish for Bloody Sunday. Also, I think there was an apology issued there, so they can do it. They have paid money in the past, and we'll see what they decide to do. But it can take a long time. Sometimes these campaigns can take 10 or 15 years. In fact, it might not be the Labour government we're dealing with now. It might be a completely different government in the future. But we won't let them wait that long in order to respond initially to the petition. They're going to have to respond, soon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you know, Munib Al-Masri, his children are dear friends of ours. We grew up together after the Lebanon War. And so his children, whether it's, Adina, Omar, etc., Mazen, will all follow through well into whatever it takes, I think. I don't think they're just going to let it go because it's too important, if you like, a precedence for Palestine. But Victor, so Britain Owes Palestine, this campaign is really important. We've talked about what success could look like in terms of an apology. But how do you then build on that momentum and what you started into a broader struggle or solution for the Palestinian justice and liberation and all else that we hope to achieve? How can it be linked? Because I think what's been happening is everyone has been working independently, individually. This is a private campaign. It's not a government campaign. But how can one just have one big umbrella and sort of have it as a springboard towards other bigger things as well?
Big question. Beyond my pay grade. I guess you got to have a Palestinian national movement that will take in that would focus on all these issues. As you said, there's so many different private initiatives being done. I guess we can't do everything, so that's probably why that is happening, and it needs maybe to be more coordinated. I mean, nothing stops, I suppose, a state of Palestine from taking this issue up in the future if they wanted to, but then that might also, yeah. We'll see. I mean, at the moment, this is not, that discussion hasn't happened. And I hope it doesn't need to happen because I hope the British government will respond.
But it's something good, something to think about because it's really important to.
We're always thinking about, but I can't say everything on the.
No, I know.
Putting
too much responsibility on you, Victor.
Because you're going to put this on YouTube, and it's some things we have to hold back on.
True.
Victor, we're going to put all of the necessary links in the bio of this podcast. But in the meantime, what can our listeners and viewers do to help this campaign?
So we have a website, BritainOwesPalestine.org, one word. There's social media pages you can access via the web page. You can share the web page. I mean, it's got the petition in Arabic and English. It's got shortened versions. It's got videos. It's got all links to all the newspaper articles and interviews that have been done about the campaign. So anything about the campaign and the petition will be on that website. Right. You may also want to share a piece I wrote for ABC. If you're able to, when you share the video, just share the hyperlink because I think it's a good summary of the petition, and it includes some pretty powerful photographs I've never seen before. Although I noticed Anne Marie's film. I don't know where she actually has archival images from the mandate in color, which was quite incredible, and how she juxtaposes that with the actual film, which I thought was really moving.
Fantastic. And yes, this is a call out to everybody. We interviewed Anne-Marie Jasser a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, and do go and see her film Palestine 36, which is opening in cinemas on the 31st of October here in the UK. And
Ireland as well.
And in Ireland and various other countries, I think. As Edward Said once said, the intellectual's role is to present alternative narratives and other perspectives on history than those provided by the combatants on behalf of official memory and national identity. So we thank Victor for coming in today in that role as intellectual to just push our thinking a little bit. History will judge all of us by how we've responded to what is going on in the world today and to the actions that we take or don't take to stop the ongoing erasure and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, using food as a weapon, the intentional Israeli man-made starvation, and this barbaric live-streamed Gaza genocide. If nothing else, stop buying Starbucks and McDonald's. Look up the ways that you can use your purchasing power to buy better things from smaller producers who are not participating in this genocide economically. It is our responsibility to speak out and act against injustice. Thank you. Take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to today's episode, because that engagement really helps us in a world where social media companies are shadow banning Palestinian content. Victor, thank you again for coming back to the Enlightenment Podcast, our first returning guest, for your scholarship, your courage, and for being part of this groundbreaking campaign, Britain Owes Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamim, and thank you so much, Hanan. Really, really great to be back.
Lovely to have you, and say that stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, speak up, and most importantly, take action for justice for Palestine. Our collective voice makes a change in the world, and in solidarity and with appreciation, see you next time. And cousin Victor, thank you again for being part of the team that's exposed how Britain violated international law and continues to do so, and for all that you do for Palestine. Proud of you, cousin.
Thank you so much, Hanan. Likewise, proud of all your work.